Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's great music to walk onto, by the way. I'm accustomed to walking onto Phil Collins songs, so that's by far the best music I've ever walked onto a stage to. There was only one occasion when being called Phil Collins was at all useful. There was one moment when Peter Gabriel came into Downing Street to lobby us for performance rights with Bob Geldof, and I went down to join the meeting, and he came over, I greeted him, and he held his hand out. He's a very friendly man. He held his hand out and said, "Good afternoon, my name's Peter Gabriel." And I said, "Hi, I'm Phil Collins. I'm so glad we could get back together again." At which the Prime Minister looked at us both and said, "Do you two know each other?" I said, "No, you idiot, it's a Genesis joke." I sort of cut my teeth writing speeches for the Prime Minister, Tony Blair. Since then, I've written for lots of other people too. I've written in lots of different settings and formats. Lots of charitable leaders, lots of corporate leaders in the private sector, and some public sector figures, including some recent politicians and current politicians, in fact, including the current leader of the Labour Party. So I've written speeches across lots of different sectors and subjects. And what I'm going to talk about now in the next half an hour or so is the distilled wisdom, such as it is, of the things which apply to all of those settings. And I'll as I go along, I'll talk about some of the differences and some of the peculiarities of them. But I want to leave you both with a template of what a good compositional process might look like, which might be practically useful, but also make some remarks along the way about what makes for a good speech and what are the components of something which might endure. Because speeches which last are rarer than we think. I mean, there are thousands are done every day, and very few of them will ever be committed to memory. Most of them disappear. But let's start at the beginning. I want to walk you through the whole process of it. And of course, like any act, when you become accustomed to doing something, when you become proficient in an act, you do it more quickly than this. But I'm going to take us through it quite slowly so as to labour each point, so as to emphasize the moments where the process can go badly wrong. And it often does go badly wrong. Everything I say is going to be obvious, I hope. It's because good writing is not a series of complicated maneuvers. It's actually the endless reproduction of the basics at a higher level each time. It's a bit like sport in that sense, that the people who are brilliant at football are not doing something fundamentally different from the people who are less good at it, they're just doing it better. And writing is like that. So it's a series of basic elements which I'm going to put them in a certain order, and I'm going to lay the emphasis in certain places which may not be so obvious, but the components of this tutorial will be very familiar to you. The first familiar point is obviously we have to begin by contemplating our audience. It's so obvious, in fact, that we're liable to forget this. We're liable to skimp on it because it's boring. Why do I have to think about them? But it's an act of selection. The first moment of writing takes place when you contemplate who is in the audience. Who do you regard as your audience? Which may be a different question from who's actually sitting there before you. Your audience may be extensive, they may be not in the room, they may these days be online, or they may consume a cut up and fragmented version of your speech at a later date. You've got to think about all of those possible audiences. The only way that you can cover an audience which is multiple and with different characteristics is to speak and write in plain English. And this is something which will recur as I speak, that the language, the sectional language, the idiom of the particular private vocabulary is the enemy of good communication, particularly when we have a multidiscipline, multifarious audience. We need to acquire a language, which we've all got, in fact, which is the language of educated plain English, because that language will always satisfy the expert, who will never say, "I wish you'd say that again, only in more technical language." But it will, at the same time, it's also possible to make somebody who's not part of the initiated understand what you're saying. So the meeting point between the expert and the non-expert is at the level of plain educated English. And that audience map that we're drawing is a crucial component of making selections about what we're going to include, because I need to have a sense of the degree of expertise my audience has. Do they know a lot? or do they know very little? I need to know where they are. I need to know, broadly speaking, what do they think? Because what's going to follow in this piece of writing is an attempt to persuade them of something, or at least persuade some of them of something. There may be those in the audience who already agree with what I've got to say, in which case the exchange is going to be much less interesting. There's always a part of a political speech which is an attempt to rally the faithful, to flatter you with things that you already think, and to enlist myself in the things that you are already thinking. And there's a nice feeling there, but nothing really serious is taking place because there's no conflict. And serious speech writing is about conflict. So I need to locate where the conflict is in this exchange, and I need to find the people in this audience who don't quite think what I think, and on whom I'm going to perform some kind of act where I'm going to try and shift them. I'm going to try and move them. And the use of the emotional term is quite telling, because that's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to try and move them. I can't be too ambitious here. I can't realistically hope in the course of a 30-minute monologue move somebody's worldview fundamentally. That's not going to happen. But I need to have a limited ambition. I need to have a range within which I might persuade you to move your position somewhat, or at least question the validity of the position that you begin with. So I need to have a sense of what is the exchange I'm about to take, that's about to take place in the piece of writing I'm going to do. And you can see when you think of it like that, you're already making a whole series of selections about what you will and what you won't talk about, and what you will and you won't include. So I'm writing already. Writing in this process I'm describing is going to come very late. And this is the key to the prevention of the apparently glamorous condition known as writer's block. It's always intrigued me that only writers are allowed to say they have a sort of disease that prevents them from doing any work. I mean, if anybody else turned up at your house, like the plumber turned up and said, "I'm so sorry, I just can't get started. I've got a sort of plumber's block," you'd say, "Please stop being so lazy, get on with it." And the same is true of writers. I mean, you really just have to get on with it. And this, as I say, apparently glamorous condition of writer's block is in fact usually a sort of thinking block. It's not that we can't write, it's that we don't know what to say. We don't know what we're about to do. If you think clearly through the process of writing and you're very clear what you want to say, it is then almost impossible not to write because it's easy to do so. And this is the second component of the process, that every piece of good writing stands or falls on the clarity of its central proposition. And if you can't tell me in a single sentence what you're trying to say, then you don't know. And if you don't know, then you're not ready to start. And although a finished text is going to have many subordinate arguments and secondary thoughts and digressions and illustrations and anecdotes, it's also going to have something which is a driving force. It's going to have a governing idea. And it's going to have a proposition. And that proposition must be something which is not banal. The bane of most speech writing is not that it's bad or that it's poorly written, it's that it's boring. It's banal. It begins with a platitude, and therefore it never ascends to anything other than banality. And most corporate writing is of that kind. And the private sector is absolutely full of terribly banal writing. And the reason for this is that the writer has not had the courage to isolate a genuine proposition at the beginning. Now, that genuine proposition must be something with which a reasonable person might disagree. It doesn't have to therefore be controversial, because we're not necessarily writing a polemic, but it does have to be something upon which you can imagine another side. So if I were to say something like, I'm going to write a speech about Brexit, that is not a good proposition because it doesn't say anything. There's no disagreement there. Or if I were to say, I'm going to write a speech for a corporate leader on the fact that our people are our greatest asset. That's not a good proposition either because it's so banal. Because nobody would in their right mind would argue the opposite. No one would say we're going to stand up and speak for 20 minutes about how our people are all totally useless. Now, that might be true, but it's not something you'd ever say. So, and therefore, there's no conflict in this proposition. There's nobody then on the other side in the audience thinking, I don't agree. Nothing is happening. So we have to have a proposition with which at least it's possible to disagree. It has to be something that has another side. So if I were writing a piece on Brexit, it would have to be something along the lines of Brexit was and is a magnificent idea which has been going swimmingly all along. Because it is possible to disagree with that proposition. Likewise, I could say the opposite, and it would then have the virtue of truth if I said the opposite, but I could also find there are people. I can imagine people who disagree with me, and that's the crucial thing. When we get a statement which is both pertinent to that section of the audience you've decided you want to move, and you've isolated something that they don't think, then you've got the basis of a speech. At this point, we've done an awful lot of editorial selection, and we've absolutely ensured that it's not going to be difficult to start writing, because we know what we're doing. And I'd really implore you, if you are writing something, to spend perhaps the bulk of your time up to this point. That getting that core proposition might come quickly if you know your field well and you know exactly what you're doing, but it might not. It might take quite a long time. It might take 2 or 3 goes. You might go down a blind alley. You might find that the original thought you had doesn't quite work. You might need to research it. You might need to read. You might need to discuss it. I'm very experienced in doing this, and I do all of those things all the time. And I'm always searching for it. And Margaret Drabble put this beautifully once when she was asked about her latest novel. She said it's going really well. Instead of I've basically finished. All I've got to do now is write it. And she works like this. She has it. Salman Rushdie works like this a lot of the time. She has it so intricately planned and all the conflicts plotted in her mind, sometimes on a sort of elaborate map on paper, that the actual composition of it then becomes pleasurable. That's not to say you don't find new things in the composition. Of course you do, particularly in the writing of fiction, but also in the writing of a speech. Of course you surprised yourself. Of course you do. It's not absolutely a map as such. It's a guide, and it's a form of discipline. Because what you then do in the writing is you're always looking back at that central proposition. I sometimes, in fact, write it on a post-it note and stick it in front of me so as to keep myself disciplined and ordered. And if you can't get it on the post-it note in the first place, it's too long. And it acts as a kind of discipline. I'm always thinking that when I'm going into the next section of the writing, am I still answering that question? Is this in some way a deepening or an elaboration of that central proposition? And if it isn't, I've got to ask myself, well, why not? Because, as Arthur Miller said, all good writing is like an organism. There's nothing wasted. Everything refers back. Everything is used. And so the real discipline comes when you have got the skill to take a wonderful story or a great joke, but expel it from the text because it's not relevant. It's really difficult to do sometimes because you think, well, that's going to be a great moment if I tell that joke. The audience will love it. They'll think I'm a very funny character and they'll feel sympathy for me. But it's not actually pertinent to this particular speech. Or I've got these facts and they're really telling and important, but they don't actually tell this particular story. Having the skill and the discipline to take them out is the actual, that's when you know you're doing well.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.